Welcome to the webinar, and looking forward to this discussion about power, authority, and influence, the hidden challenges of succession planning, which can lead to frustration or confusion when decisions get stalled or reversed, or people become reluctant to engage in discussions about future leadership. Unspoken tensions develop in a number of other issues that we'll explore today during the conversation. I'm Justin Albertson, and leading the conversation are two of my colleagues from FBCG, Rebecca Trobe and Josh Nacht. Rebecca brings over 25 years of experience in the realm of family enterprise and organizational leadership. She's a highly experienced family systems clinical psychologist and executive coach, and her work focuses on supporting families in reaching their highest potential and goals for success. Josh is one of our principal consultants. He's helped family businesses of all sizes create and develop communication and decision-making processes that enable family harmony. And his experience also includes being a married-in of a third-generation business and a second-generation owner of his family's business. Together, they've worked with a few dozen families, and today we get to tap into that experience as we uncover and explore how formal and informal power dynamics in succession planning can stall progress, create uncertainty, and cause communication and relationship breakdowns, and some other things that they'll discuss today. So really looking forward to that. I'm glad that we have a chance to tap into this experience today. Few notes before we get started. We are recording today's session, and we will send out an email with a link to access the webinar either tomorrow or Monday. Quick note on confidentiality. Any references that we make today to any clients will be anonymous, or they'll be an amalgamation of multiple situations. And we will be taking questions, which you can submit anonymously, meaning we won't announce who is asking the questions. Use the Q&A feature to submit those questions, and we'll ask those questions periodically through the session. We'll also have a survey at the end of the webinar, and we'll greatly appreciate your feedback if you'd be so kind to fill that out for us. One more thing before we dive in. We have 3 poll questions so we can get to know you a little bit better today. The first one is, what generation are you in your family business? Wow, that was fast. You guys are right on it. I can see the numbers coming in. We'll give you just another few moments or so. Looks like we have a lot of entrepreneur first generation. Got a few down there in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Wow, that's impressive. That's impressive. Okay, let's try question number 2. So there's a quick breakdown of where we're at with the group. So thank you for that. We have question 2. There we go. Which of the following power dynamics or tensions have you experienced? You can choose more than one. So reluctance to let go, second guessing, balancing personal relationships with business needs, lack of open dialogue. It's fun to watch the numbers start here. I can see them. Okay, we got a pretty good spread. Give you just another moment or two, and then we'll end the poll and I'll share the results. Okay, so pretty good even spread there across those. We'll be tapping into all these today as we talk. All right, one more. Question 3. Which of the following best represents your family's enterprise? Is it a family-owned operating company with family in leadership or board governance? Is it a diverse family holdings or assets with family primarily in ownership beneficiary roles? We got a lot of owner-operators, it looks like, today. Or family office or foundation, or you have another. right, we'll give you just another moment. Family-owned operating company is leading the charge here. Got three quarters in operating companies. Great. All right. Well, thank you for helping us get to know you just a little bit today. And regardless of where you're at in those different dimensions, we've seen these dynamics that we're going to talk about today play out in all types of situations. So let's get the conversation started. Josh, Rebecca, tell us a little bit about how did this topic emerge?
Yeah, thanks, Justin. And I think I'm going to reiterate that the for the polling questions and the people responding where we see, there's obviously families from all different generations, and we see these dynamics emerging in a variety of situations depending on your generation, depending on your setup. It's going to look different. It may feel a little bit different, but some of the underlying dynamics are the same. And so when we explain these things today, we really encourage you to think about how does this apply to you and your unique situation, even though, we maybe speaking in some big picture scenarios. We do also see this, the events, the dynamics, the things that we're talking about emerge particularly with first to second generation situations. And we'll explain why. We'll look into that. And they also emerge a lot with companies with operating businesses. Again, not exclusively, but we see in that first generation, there's an entrepreneur, there's a creator. This person has taken something that emerged from nothing, and it was an idea, it was a need, and they've built it on their own. So there's some particular dynamics and emotions that emerge in that situation that I think we will focus on in some of our examples. But again, think of how this applies to a wide range of situations. This emerged from a client that I was working with, and I brought Rebecca in as an additional resource. And this was a pattern that I was seeing emerge in meetings. And then when Rebecca came in, she was able to give new light and perspective to it that I think was incredibly helpful and has led to a lot of the thinking around this. This is a family moving from first to second generation, and there's four G2 siblings. And what we were seeing in the meetings, we were setting up ownership meetings. We were really setting up how do we do the continuity process from the first to the second generation. And in this case, because of their trust structure and their assets, the patriarch, G1, had really given over functional power and authority to the second generation. So like voting control, voting rights was in the hands of those four G2 siblings. And what was happening when we had ownership meetings and we were gathering people together, it was kind of difficult sometimes to gather people. Everybody's busy doing different things. I was really encouraging the importance of these meetings and the importance of not just showing up, but actually engaging and really talking. And this was an interesting, when we talk about disengagement, it was kind of the proof is in the pudding, right? People's actions speak louder than words. They said they wanted to be involved, but they weren't fully involved. And what we were also seeing in some of these meetings is that when G2 is supposed to make a decision, was supposed to engage in a topic, they were really reluctant to step into that power they had been granted because they were always waiting to see what dad would say. And they were always waiting to see what he might say in the group or what he might say under his breath. And I think we are seeing that although in theory power and authority had been transferred, it was a lot more difficult for that second generation to actually step into that power because with patriarch in the room, they were all deferring to him in a lot of situations. And this was something that was really interesting to me. And I think in bringing in Rebecca and having a new perspective on this, we started to really look in a new way about how that family leader was holding on to a significant amount of power and influence. And we started to look at how is this happening consciously in a way that's very intentional, or how is this happening unconsciously? Because he said he wanted to transfer power. He said he wanted the second generation to take over and, and lead and carry it into the future. But his actions weren't always supporting that. And I think Rebecca has done a lot of thinking around this and was able to provide a perspective that opened a lot of eyes and was certainly very helpful. I know you've done a lot around this, Rebecca, and actually have a model that's helped illustrate some of these dynamics. And I wonder if you could explain a little bit more about what you saw happening in this situation.
Happy to, Josh. Thank you. And nicely illustrated. And did, the terrific work that you did really paved the way for the two of us to be able to open up this dialogue and discussion with this family in a unique way using this model that we're about to show you. So the big issue that we really are sort of offering to you today is the idea of theory of transferring power, authority, influence, right? And having the leadership dynamic shift versus the practice of doing that and the challenge that lies between theory and practice. So let's show the model and we're going to talk a little bit about it and then we're going to share some examples of how to work with it. We're just going to wait for it to come up. Great. Thank you, Kelly. Okay, so Josh graciously was very interested in integrating this into the work that we were doing together, and we really jumped in together to utilize it. And you all can see that this is named the relational currency and family dynamics model for a reason. The top triangle is a very dynamic triangle that in family enterprise and just enterprise in general, but particularly this is contextualized to family enterprise, that the top triangle are the things that are constantly on the dashboard of anyone who is sitting in a decision-making and leadership role, which is money, at the top corner, right? It's interchangeable. The corners are not significant. It's just that they're represented as these elements and factors of what is top of mind. So money at the one corner, leadership at one corner of the triangle, and then in the third corner is power and authority and influence parenthetically there lies underneath that dynamic. In the middle of the triangle is usually a mission statement that is a guiding and the set of guiding principles that is guiding the organization directionally and where it's headed, and usually the thing that everyone is aligned around in the direction of the enterprise, right? What is the enterprise about? What is the purpose of it? Underneath that triangle, of course, are the complexities that lie within being a part of because this is a very unique sport to play, is it not, right? Having family as a priority, right? As connecting with family, working together with family in the context of business. So money and family together. And underneath that, the second triangle, the family dynamics are always coming up through into the first triangle to interrupt and be a part of something around the decision-making table. Underneath the family dynamics, the thing that contributes to family dynamics are the family system that you are a part of, nuclear family, right? All the different branches, and then the bigger family system, often multi-branch, rather large, dependent on your family system, and then your own individual identity, right? Contributing to how you participate in the family dynamics of not only the family system, but in the family governance work, in the family decision-making at the leadership table around the enterprise, all of those components. So we really wanted to lay this out for you because we wanted you to see the elements that we use to help make sense of what is going on around any kind of generational transition around power, authority, influence, leadership. Josh, want to see if you want to make any comments or lean in here about what your experience was in our work here?
Well, I think what was really helpful for this family and that we want to share with you is that this gave it gave words and a visual sense to the family of things that they had been experiencing, but weren't able to fully understand. And even as, in the course of the work, we would talk about some of these elements. I think that seeing it together in one way and recognizing the interplay between all of these factors helped everybody in the family understand to a deeper level some of the dynamics that they had been experiencing. So it's a good way to understand the situation, the challenges, the multiple interests that people have that we're all getting mixed together in a way that can be really, really confusing. right? So being able to look at something like this in a theoretical sense can be helpful because it gives you a framework for understanding.
Well
The
said.
framework, yeah. And the framework isn't enough to fully, okay, well, it's like, okay, I understand it. This makes sense. Well, now what do I do with it? Because there is a lot at stake here, and it can be very confusing, kind of overwhelming to say, well, how do we manage all of these different pieces?
Right. And that Josh and I are both very committed to when we work together. I think we can say this about most any of our colleagues is committed to normalizing this experience, right? This is a very normal thing to happen. The notion and the theory and the idea of transferring power is often top of mind. Everyone agrees to it. When you have a consultant in the mix and they say, okay, let's start transferring power and here's the process. And we develop a process and it seems like it's all going to go smoothly. Inevitably, transferring from theory and the idea and the agreement and the alignment around it, right? And then moving it into the actual practice. Josh was saying earlier that we would see in family meetings, we've seen it many, many times, that the clunkiest part is when you try and actually start putting it in play, like a sport. Like you get on the court and you start playing, and then let's just use G1 and G2 as the example here, but you all can transfer this into your own generational context, which is G1, right? A wealth creator or an enterprise creator. That is like a baby. When you create something and you have a lot of attachment to it and you've put your whole self into it, your heart, your mind, your dollars, your family, everything, that is a high stakes endeavor. So the idea of, in theory, transferring power to the next generation, great idea. Yes, usually all in on some level. However, once the idea of transferring power and total authority and leadership, even in portions, right? Not in totality, but even in little increments over time, it creates often a sense of ambivalence. On one hand, yes, of course, I want to transfer power to the next generation. I want this to go on. We want continuity. We want succession to happen. And yet, this is my baby, right? I created it, I founded it, I did all of this. How am I going to effectively step out of the mix elegantly? Where's that balance between remaining and having a voice and feeling like you matter and that you're relevant to the system still, while you're trying to offer the next generation their chance to lead and their voice to be in the mix? Can you see how that would create some tension and create some both conscious and unconscious ambivalence about wanting to cross over and actually allow the next generation to play full on the court together? So that is the big issue that we see and that we run into is when G1 and G2 often feels unintentionally undermined, or whatever subsequent generation that is about to come into leadership, they often feel undermined, or they feel like, wait a minute, you said one thing and you're doing another. Why is that happening? And it's very confusing. And often it causes paralysis in the system because the people don't want to bring up conflictual things. No one wants to bring up conflict. People are often quite afraid of it for obvious reasons. However, it does start to sow the seeds of, we want one thing. We thought we were going to be doing this way. And the founder and the wealth creator or the preceding generation is saying, well, yes, but dot, dot, dot. So that's where we start to run into trouble with working on how to make it work in practice.
Yeah. And Rebecca, I think I want to highlight for everybody that this is a highly emotional process, right? That there's a lot of emotions for the first generation as they feel that sense of this is my baby. And again, for any generation who is in power and transferring out, the effort that they've put into it, sometimes this is a lifelong effort and care and attention and the sentiment of this is a very emotional event to step out of the identity of being in power, to step out of that sense of this is my responsibility. And there's a lot of emotions involved in transferring that over to whatever that next generation is. Can I trust you? Can I, ensure that you're going to carry things forth with the same level of care that I have? That can be a very emotional event. And I think that sometimes people are aware of that. And sometimes people aren't aware of that, and all the emotions are inside, and it can create a lot of feelings of dissonance and just real difficulties. It's also very emotional for that next generation, whether that's G2 or G5, wherever you're at, because oftentimes the next generation has the emotions of, well, why don't you trust me? I want to do it. This is what I've been waiting for for however many years. And if you give me a shot, I'll prove to you that I can do it. And when they feel undermined or they don't feel trusted, that can bring up a lot of tough emotions as well. Why don't you trust me? Let me show you how much I care and what I bring to the table. So I think that I bring that up because the emotions involved really magnify the dynamics and the challenges of this situation. And by bringing some awareness to that, it can help people start to understand, hey, this is not just something in theory. It's not just about our voting agreement or the documents that we've created, but this is something that's really meaningful to both generations, and that magnifies a lot of the dynamics in the model that we're talking about here.
We have a question about the work of the business.
Hmm.
Where do you see the actual work of the business fall, either in this model or how the model applies? Oftentimes family members have uh, perceptions of unequal effort and time and skill levels and things like that.
So the work of the business usually falls in the leadership category, and it's connected, right? You can see all the aspects of the triangle are interconnected, and they feed into each other dynamically. It's a very dynamic set of triangles. So the work of the business is at the center, which is the mission, and having a mission aligned focus is where the work is being done. But the focus of the work has everything to do. Every time a decision is usually coming up at the decision-making table or putting something new into effect or any kind of change initiative that's taking place, what is top of mind is what is the impact on the financial well-being of the enterprise? Where is power, authority, and influence happening within the system? Who is leading whatever component is being decided upon, or multiple components, right? Or a large scale initiative. And then the leadership component is, are you putting together? Is this a leadership team? All the anatomy of this is quite explicit. So that's why this triangle, although it seems simple, is quite packed. And then using this on an ongoing basis with CEOs and leadership teams and executive teams and family teams is very helpful, because they can see where the family dynamics start to come up and interfere with the effectiveness of the decision making and the transfer of power and leadership, or even just the dynamic balance over time. It's usually constantly disrupting a nice flow if it's not resolved and it's not, and people are not aware of how to work with it effectively. So to Josh's point, the case that we brought up, the client example that we were bringing up, one of the pieces we want to think about is that family, the patriarch was quite unconscious to his need and desire to hang on to some of his original authority, power, and influence. It was not intentional. It was quite unconscious. And how did we know that? So they were sitting around the table making some decisions, generation one, parents, right? Mom and dad, patriarch and matriarch, with their next generation. And although they were sitting back for a while, trying to be supportive, trying to hold back, really trying to put theory into practice, as soon as the second generation started to make moves toward ratifying a decision, right, coming to a vote and moving it in a direction, the fact that it moved in a direction that might have been slightly counter to what something the patriarch might have done on his own in a solo decision-making capacity, he decided to intervene, right? Just after about an hour of rich, really well executed decision making being facilitated a little bit by me and Josh, a little bit by the family office leader executive. And why is that important? Because later on, the patriarch came to us and said, why do you think they disengaged? Why do you think that the conversation kind of got derailed and the energy kind of went out of the room afterward? And it was because all the work that had gone in to the decision that was quite a big one about where they were going to move some of the assets, what things were going to be planned. It was connected to trust and estate planning. It was connected to distributions. It was a big set of decisions that they were making that day. And so the wind went out of the sails of generation two. And G1 noticed it, but wasn't clear about what happened and why.
Thank you.
I'll highlight too that a lot of the things that we're talking about are the work of ownership and being an owner. You know, we talk about a lot about wearing multiple hats in family businesses and family enterprises. And so we recognize that, you know, especially for a lot of people on the webinar, you have an operating business, right? That was over 75% of you. And so there's a challenge here because you still have to operate the business on a day-to-day basis. You are still running and operating with all of those responsibilities, while you also have to manage a lot of these topics, which are often related to ownership and the work of being an owner. Now, I recognize there's a lot of crossover there, and sometimes there's a lot of overlap. But this can be a particular challenge as you have to focus on your day-to-day operational responsibilities. You have to focus on business strategy. Where are we going in the long term? And you have to focus on the work of being an owner and transferring the power, authority, influence, the decision making to the next generation. Again, whatever generation that is. That's the work about being an owner. And when these things all cross together, it can be quite challenging. And this is why, you know, we really encourage when we talk about wearing multiple hats, that there's specific time and energy devoted to the work of ownership and continuity from one generation to the next. And certainly when we look at the model, we talk about the work of being an owner, it can transfer over into your operating responsibilities. And it does take specific attention and time and energy to manage well. So I think something Rebecca and I, you know, both really encourage with families is let's be really clear about when you're talking about business operations, business strategy, and when we're talking about matters of ownership. And being specific about those helps you manage each of those in a way that they get the attention that they deserve, and things don't all mush together into a variety of conversations and topics, and we're starting in one topic, and all of a sudden we're over here, and this topic about, hey, when is it my turn? And it can be very difficult when all those things mix together. So, you know, as we start to move into talking about, well, what do we do with these challenging situations? I think that's one piece that we want to highlight, that it can be really beneficial to devote specific time to these matters of ownership and continuity and transferring power, in addition to and in a really complementary fashion to your business operations and your business strategy.
Yeah, well, Josh, do you have another question, Josh?
I was just going to say the thing that just struck me, Josh, is you mentioned the energy and like the energy to do the work. Like this is, you know, kind of a lot going on under the surface, right? What have you seen that is maybe most helpful for a family to really just be prepared to work through some of these challenges?
Yeah, I think that something I encourage the clients that I work with is to adopt an ownership mindset and to adopt a continuity mindset, meaning that this work can be challenging, it's complex, you know, and it really takes place over time. You know, I think we all know when we talk about transferring ownership and power, control, and decision making, this is not an event. This is truly a process. And I see the families who succeed at this, they take a proactive approach. They say, we know this is on the way. We know this is coming. So let's really start to work with it up front. And let's recognize it is going to take years. So let's work with it on a consistent basis. And let's try things out. Let's see where we succeed. Let's see where it's really difficult. And they learn from what's working and what's not working because they're meeting as owners. They're meeting to do the work of continuity. and transferring from one generation to the next in a consistent manner. That there's a rhythm, whether they're meeting monthly or bi-monthly or quarterly, but that work is consistent. And that's what I mean by energy, is that they invest in themselves and they invest in the work of transferring not just, ownership, but the decision making, the power, all of the dynamics they attend to. And, I really tell people this is work. It's not going to happen by itself. But if you invest in the work and you invest in both the logistics, the technical aspects, and the emotional, the relational, the family aspects, that's where these families are able to manage what is, a challenging set of events.
Well said, Josh. Justin, did you have another question? I wanted to just cap on to that from the
Yeah,
analysis. Is that
go ahead. Go ahead.
okay? To Josh's point, I like to think of this work as a sport, and the stamina that it takes to play this sport. We showed you these relational currencies for a reason, is because you're playing a very unique sport. And in that sport, there's a mindset, right? You adopt these mindsets that Josh is speaking so well to. And the idea of playing that sport together, which you saw the model, identity and understanding your own identity and your leadership identity, particularly, right? So you have your identity within the family, which is an interesting role that came from early days, right? It's hard to transcend that. That's a component of working in family enterprises, that your family identity and your identity in the family system travels with you, right? The history of your experience of being part of a family system travels with you into the experience of being an adult in an enterprise where people have known you throughout the entire trajectory of your growth experience, usually, which is an unusual dynamic. When adults enter a system where they're working for someone else that has nothing to do with their family, they don't have that part of their identity as a factor in the experience. So then you come into your leadership identity, and sculpting your leadership identity when you're also dealing with the identity that you've had for a long time with your siblings, with your parents, with your cousins, et cetera, is an additional dynamic that loads the deck in terms of power dynamics, which is why we're talking about that today. The idea of power dynamics that emerge from the experience of being in a family, which are not spoken about and not addressed, suddenly come to light as very important in the world of the enterprise, because you are making decisions together that are high stakes and necessary, and you're all playing this sport together. But now you need to bring them to light in order to have the mission met. The mission is the central experience that everyone is working in and operating around. So the commitment to that mission, right, is different than being committed as a family when you're growing up, which is a whole different experience. So you have to shift that mindset. And the notion of understanding your relationship to power, your notion of understanding your relationship to authority, your notion of understanding how you influence the system are all mature adult components of being an effective leader. So that's one of the reasons we're emphasizing this with and sharing it with you today, is it has a direct impact on how you lead, how you think, and how you mature into the system.
Yeah. Yeah. So we do have a number of questions around the topic of like engagement. So how to engage and involve either the leading generation or maybe the founder and or the next gen. And there's a bunch of different dynamics that people have highlighted in the questions. So I don't know if kind of generally you guys can talk a little bit about, how do you use this concept and working through these issues that are beneath the surface to help create more engagement, encourage people to be involved and really come to the table and start to have the dialogue they need to have.
Josh, do you want to talk a little bit about what we've been doing with this same family around power, authority, influence, and introducing it to the system and starting to bring it to a new level of awareness?
Yeah, and I think the word awareness is really key here as a first step, right? And that is, part of our role sometimes can be to highlight what's going on in a way that the family says, oh, okay, that helps me understand the dynamics at play here. That helps me understand what's happening on a group level, on a systemic level, and on an individual level. And awareness is only part, right? That the work based on awareness is, what do I do based on that? What do I do that can be different, that can be new, and can help me both as an individual and help us as a system function better? So I think that the first step is awareness and bringing, insight and some of the theory to light, so people can say, oh, like, look, I recognize how all these things interplay. I recognize my part in it as an individual, and I start to recognize how this is playing out within the system. So there's an interesting piece of awareness, and then there's an interesting piece of how individuals play into this larger dynamic. So there can be real benefit for individuals, and sometimes that's households as well, because we recognize spouses can be very involved in this dynamic and they're involved in the conversation. So sometimes it's not just individuals, it's households and spouses to look at their part in this. What part are you contributing to healthy functioning? How might you be contributing because of, again, emotions, desires, your perspective to things that might be difficult with others? And then once we do some individual work, then we can work with the system and say, okay, how are all of you as individuals interacting? And where does this come out in a group setting? Because I think, like with our first example, individually people can understand things, but then as in families, and you think of your own family and your own dynamic, you come together and it can look like something entirely different. And I've seen families where they get together and it's super heated, they're hot, the emotions are there, it's out. And I've seen other families where it's the opposite, where they get together and everybody kind of sits like this, and they pull back, and the silence is overwhelming because nobody knows how to talk about these things. So I think that interplay, and that's part of our role, as facilitators, is to be able to highlight these things and then facilitate a conversation with it in a way that, families really struggle with on their own because of those dynamics and because this is some intense and emotionally loaded work.
Yeah.
What would you have to add to that, Rebecca, particularly with our work here?
Yeah, it's really well said. So I think that the piece that is the big piece, Josh, and I want to drive home is normalizing this process. This is a very unique sport to play, and it is very inside the sport you are playing. This is a very normal dynamic. So it's very important that everyone sort of take a step back, take a breath, and say, compare from a comparison standpoint, if we put you all in a room together, you would have a lot of people saying, oh, me too. Yes. What's your experience like? Oh, ours is a little bit like this. The nuance is slightly different, but the core themes are very similar, which is why you're with us today. So one of the things about the idea of putting theory into practice and playing this sport effectively is thinking about, Josh talks about facilitation, but of course, behind the facilitation is design, right? And there's often a non-linearity to this experience that can be frustrating, but is also important to be patient around, right? You're going to make strides in this if there's a well-designed process to help put theory into practice in a very effective way. Initial stage is what Josh was talking about, is raising the level of awareness of the players on the court, who's involved in the process, right? We want to raise the level of awareness on the individual level. And then we want to bring those new levels of awareness together in the context of a group mindset, right? To align. And there's a lot of work around alignment here, which is, can G1, right? Or whatever preceding generation is leading at the moment, how can they make shifts in order to incrementally start to move into, yes, the transfer of power is happening, and what does that generation need to tolerate and practice while they're on the court when they feel things like ambivalence, when they feel things like reticence to transfer, when they feel things they need to practice a certain aspect of the sport, right? And then the next generation who's receiving that transfer of power, authority, and influence, one of the interesting parts is G1's often big concern is, or the leading generation's big concern is, if I transfer power and authority and influence to you, will you pick it up and execute well in the way that we all hope for and envision? And that's where that trust piece is the willingness to trust. So often we were working with this family and we had one of the members say, well, I mean, you have to earn trust, right? Trust has to be earned. And Josh and I both said, actually, trust in some stages needs to be granted, right? It's not necessarily an earned currency right out of the gate. You have to grant it in order to cross that bridge sometimes. And so sometimes G1 has to be willing to offer trust in the face of lack of certainty, right? And that G2 is trying to get the next generation is trying to get up to speed and play on the court and do what they need to do, but they need time to learn and to play and to practice. So there's that big bridge that really everyone's trying to cross together, but we need to weave the threads to allow that trust bridge to be built effectively. Any comments, Josh, on that?
Well, I think, to build on that, I think that when we're talking about trust, and this plays into the ability to transfer power, right? It needs to be granted and earned, right? That it is a co-created process.
Yes.
And that's why we really encourage this to be patient, to be kind to yourselves, because this takes place over time. And as Rebecca said, it's not linear. Sometimes you make progress, like, oh, look, we're making great progress. And then you hit a bump. There's a stumble. Oh, we take a step back. But don't have that step back be a disaster, right? Or be really deconstructive. Be kind to yourselves and say, okay, this didn't work. What happened here? Where's the accountability? Let's learn from this and let's continue on this process, because the families that succeed at successfully transferring from one generation to another and working with power and decision making in these, again, they invest in the long term over it. And that when there's bumps, because there will be, and when toes are stepped on, they can talk about it, they can learn from it, people can be accountable for everybody's part in it, and then they can move on and you can keep moving forward. And I think that's really important, so that you recognize you're not going to do it perfectly. You have to do it good enough that it's going to work, and to give each other the grace to make mistakes, to recognize people do things in a different way. And certainly the more smooth that is, the better it feels. But it's not always smooth. It can be difficult. And I think underneath all this is, what is the intent? What is your why? Why do you want your business, your assets to succeed from one generation to the next? Why do you want to create a family legacy? Why, what is your purpose? Because that can be a force. I think it is the force for alignment. And it's the guidepost. It's the North Star for why you are putting in all this work.
And to Josh's point, can I cap onto that? Josh, that's really well said. That is the motivation. So returning to a shared motivation, right, which Josh is pointing to really beautifully, is the incentivizing energy that Justin brought up. What's the energy? Is that moving, and our concern for family systems when we work with them, when we see paralysis like this, it often has to do, well, we see paralysis sometimes in systems, it often has to do with the diagnostics of what we're sharing with you today, which is something is happening in the zone of transferring power, authority, and influence succeed in a successful way. And so the way we will look at that is to say, oh, why is the paralysis happening? Okay, we want to look at that. And it looks like, oh, we need to do some work with G2 and G1, or whatever generations are relevant to you, for those of you who are listening. So how do you do that? You want to really have the nonlinearity be something where you're learning a new sport, but you need to practice. And how do we practice? So Josh and I want to just give you a very clear illustration of how we work together in the system, which is Josh was leading on the governance development puzzle piece, right, of what the totality of what the family was working on, doing an excellent job, really creating excellent systems. We were doing a lot of redesign in order to help the system be more high performance and more streamlined in their decision making. And then I did a lot of the one-on-one and group coaching for generation one and generation two to help them start to raise awareness, be aware, clarify their identities, their roles and responsibilities to be a better team as they're playing the governance sport ongoingly. So we would do incremental work. Like we're about to hit a chapter where you need to increase your stamina and your participation, engagement, and actual skill set and focus for the work that's ahead. So then we need to focus on this. So we're individual work, group work, and then transferring that work into practice in the governance meetings themselves. Josh, you want to see if you want to comment on any way that we were working together to help everybody understand how we were working within the system and how we put this into theory, into practice.
Yeah, I'll just say that obviously, as we start to frame these things out, it can be normal to feel like, wow, this is a lot, right? It's overwhelming. There's a lot of dynamics here. There's a lot of things to consider, and that's true. And that's why we say taking it slow and doing it step by step is really important. And I think that in this example, we have to be very aware of how much change is possible in a short amount of time. Like a lot of what we're talking about does take place over the long term and can really, there's an importance too. I want to recognize that we are not always just talking about family members. You can have non-family members in trusted positions and managerial positions, head of the family office positions. There's a lot of different ways that you have non-family members as, part of your resource and trusted advisor base, and that they need to be brought into this dynamic as well. They have to understand what's going on with the family, what may be going on for themselves as well. This is not unique to family members, and that by bringing in those resources, we can help the entire system understand the dynamics at play and how we're going to work with it in a step-by-step approach. And I think that being able to come together, I'd said this before, but being able to come together to talk about these matters of ownership and how it's going, what's working well, what's not working well, where we need to put attention on is a key pathway to success here. It requires, to Justin's point, it requires energy.
Gee.
And I think that is one of the pieces that I emphasize to families. People understand it, but when they're in it, and people say, gee, this is a lot of work. Well, it is. It's not going to happen by accident. You are not going to transfer these incredible businesses and your significant assets, whatever size and shape they may be, without work. It's not going to happen by accident. But by investing in it and saying, we're going to do this over the long term, that's where we see it happening successfully. And so I think that's the approach that we have taken with this client to say, this doesn't happen in a few quarters. We can certainly lay the framework. We can start to bring awareness to it, but the proof is in the practice and in the doing it. And that can be difficult, but it can also be very successful when when there's devotion to the dream, to the purpose, and the sense of why we're doing this together.
Yeah. So we have some questions that I think align with what you were just talking about.
Okay.
When people are asking about, what is the process? What are some of the steps? Can you talk a little bit more specifically about that? And when you say long term, you're saying months, that would give an idea of what you would maybe anticipate. I know that's probably a big range, but maybe talk a little bit more about when you say take it slow, what are some of the steps that you would take? How do you help the family see progress along the way? And how long should a family be prepared to put in the effort and the energy?
Do you want to take that first, Rebecca, and I can
Sure.
add in? Okay.
Sure. So it's a great question. And as any long-term experience consultant is going to say to you, who knows the work, it all depends. But inside of depending, right, there are some factors that help us really be open when we design an initial process and make recommendations, which is the client often dictates the momentum. It depends on what the kind of pace you want to put on the process of change. And to the point of needing to put energy into the work, one of the things that often we assess up front is how can the system, how can the family, how can the leadership team, whoever the constituency is that we're working with, we would recommend, if you're interested in change at this kind of a pace, then we would want you to do work at this kind of momentum over a few months. So let's say we do an initial phase of discovery work and diagnostic work to understand what is going on. That could be a 3 to 4 month process, or it could be 1 to 2 months, depending on how quickly people are willing to get into the experience and be known, understood, and then move into the second phase, which is working on actually beginning to implement change. So, and that's always different with different families, but a year of work is usually when you're coming up against power, authority, and influence dynamics, particularly in the context of continuity and succession work, then you want to think about investing 6 to 12 months as an idea for phases. And you think about it in quarters, right? Quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, quarter 4. Often we like to design in that way to have a set of accomplishments, right? Goals, milestones, and accomplishments, so that you feel like you're really moving the needle every 3 months in a very particular way. So we want people to feel like things are moving, but sometimes we need to go slow to go fast at the beginning.
Yeah, I think the pacing is important and the consistency is important, and really being realistic with a family about, what is your bandwidth? How much can you commit to meeting? And really making sure that if you commit to meeting on that schedule, let's make sure we're meeting on that schedule. We often say we bring the structure so we can frame it out month to month, quarter to quarter, over the course of years. You all have to bring the motivation and the willingness to engage, and the willingness to, put in the time and energy. So I agree with Rebecca, and I want to emphasize that for a lot of these transfers, it does take years. That doesn't mean you're always doing this intense period of work for years, but the transfer of power can often take years simply because it's significant. There's a lot of mentoring. There's a lot of dynamics to work through. I think we've also seen businesses where, the patriarch says, hey, on this date, I am leaving. I am not walking back into the office. That is another way to transfer power. And obviously, in either case, there's some trade-offs. I think what we see is that when it's thought out and there's a meaningful baton handoff, and one person ramps down, the other people ramp up. Obviously, there's an inflection point where they cross that can be significant, and people, oh, this is a big event. Yeah, it is. And, we're going to do it in a way that's paced to what meets your needs as a family and what you can invest in terms of time and energy. What other questions do we have, Justin? Just so we can.
Yeah, there's a number of different questions. And one topic that we haven't really hit on is around family values and how this work and some of these dynamics impacts family values, or how you've seen the family values play out amidst everything that you're talking about.
Josh, I wonder if we want to talk a little bit about the mission of the family that we've used as an example throughout, and how that mission emerged out of their values and has influenced the experience they're having at this point in time.
Yeah, I think values, just like the mission, are foundational, right? It is part of not just why you're doing this and what you want, your vision, like what do you want out of this? It is, how are we going to interact together? What is most important to us? And I think that it can be really helpful, again, when there's stumbling blocks, there's bumps in the roads, you can go back and say, well, why are you doing this? What is the vision? And what's most important to you as a family, for yourselves, for how you interact, and for your business? And I think it can be a real reset. And even when things get heated, it can be helpful to say, well, let's go back and look at your values. You guys said these things were really important to you. You've all agreed that here's how you're going to interact and treat each other. And maybe we're a little bit off from that. So let's come back to this common understanding, your common alignment, and your foundation for why you're doing this and how you want to operate as a family and what you want to carry forth into your business. What is your culture and the things that are most important to you?
Yes, and on that note, since the context for today is power, authority, and influence, one of the things that I think I can speak for both of us that is important to work on is often people do not have a distinguished set of values around how to operate together around power, authority, and influence, right? People avoid it like the plague. Power has a certain connotation for people. It often can really be triggering. The idea of thinking about power together is interesting, but it's very important because it's one of the central currencies of life and one of the central currencies of enterprise is figuring out whose leadership is going in what direction, how decisions are made is often all about power, whether there's a concentration of power, how power is distributed, how it's wielded, how it's shared, how it's thought about. So the notion of actually developing a very targeted, clear set of values around how you traffic and engage around and align around how you're going to be working with power and how you think, feel, what you think, feel, believe about power is actually a very important subset that most people do not have in play and is extremely helpful as a set to guide you through the tricky moments when you are unclear about how to resolve something that is directly related to a power, authority, and influence issue.
And I would just add to that, the process of creating an agreement like that can be incredibly beneficial
Absolutely.
because you're engaging together, you're learning about one another, and you're grappling with these different aspects. So the process at arriving of agreements like that, I think, is incredibly important. It's just as important as the end result.
Agreed.
Yeah.
We've just got a few minutes left,
Okay.
and maybe one last question. And it seems to me like the majority of our audience today is struggling with based on the questions, the fact that they are probably not the person in power. And a lot of questions are how do I engage? How do I get involvement with the people who are in power? And to the points made today, some reluctance, hesitancy to engage. If you have one piece of advice for how to get started for those folks, what would it be?
So, really understanding your identity around power, first and foremost, before you think about challenging it, is essential. So, the idea, or not even challenging it, but addressing it, right? We don't want to make this combative or conflictual in any way. Again, it's an extremely normal process. But the idea of thinking about it and really taking it apart and understanding the anatomy of what is going on is what is it that you want? What is it that's missing for you? Having some key guiding questions to reflect on, to say, why is this challenging me in the first place? What is it that I'm after? What is happening in the succession process? What is it that that I want to see in terms of a shift in power, and really identifying that, the clarity around what you want as a potential change in the experience of power in the system is essential first and foremost as the first stage in starting to think about effective change.
Yeah, and I would just say, very briefly that I think because this is emotional, sometimes coming from a heart place and being genuine and forthright and being able to say, hey, this is really important to me. We've laid out as a family that this is what we want. And this is something that is really important to me, and I'd like to talk about it and I'd like to explore it. Now, obviously, that has to happen different in different families and different situations. But I think coming from a place of being forthright and genuine and saying we need to look at this together as an invitation rather than, hey, you need to get out or you need to do this. It's like, can we explore this together? And sometimes that requires a third person. I mean, I recognize that. Sometimes that conversation is easier to go into. Sometimes it's more difficult. But I think we can all see the risk involved by not talking about these things and not addressing these things. So I would say the flip side is, yeah, it might be difficult to talk about. What are the consequences and the risk in not talking about it and not entering into the reality of the challenges that you're facing.
Yes. Well, I'm sure we could talk about this for the rest of the day because this is a very complex and lots of dynamics as you guys have illustrated. I want to thank you guys for sharing your experience with our audience. I want to thank everybody that's joined us today. We really hope that you found this webinar to be informative and helpful. If you have any questions, there are a lot of questions we didn't get to. We're happy to explore these with you a bit more deeply. There's a QR code here on the screen. If you want to scan that, set up some time to talk to us, we're happy to do that. As I mentioned before, there'll be a recording that's sent out to everyone either tomorrow or Monday. And we'll also have a survey that will come shortly here in just a moment. If you would be so kind to fill that out for us and provide some feedback, we greatly appreciate your thoughts and your suggestions. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Take care, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you. Bye.
Bye-bye.